Easter is coming up, right? You ready for Easter? It's next month. Yeah. So Easter begins with the letter E, so I'm going to use 4 words that begin with the letter E to summarize the evidence for the resurrection. The first E stands for execution, that Jesus was truly dead after being crucified. I used to think as an atheist, well, maybe he survived, and maybe the cool, damp air of the tomb revived him. And so that's not a resurrection, that's just a resuscitation. That's what I thought. But I looked at the evidence. What did I find? Number 1, we have no evidence anywhere of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. Secondly, most of what we accept as being true from the ancient world is based, when you get down to it, to one source of information, or maybe 2 sources of information. And yet for the death of Jesus, his execution by crucifixion, we not only have multiple first century accounts in the New Testament, we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible for his execution. Then the Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus, and this was their conclusion, quote, "Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted." I mean, you could go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludemann of Vanderbilt, and he'll tell you this, quote, "Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable." That's the atheist scholar speaking. So the first E is execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for the word early. We have early reports or accounts that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports have come so quickly after his death that you can't write it off as being a legend that grew up maybe 100, 150, 200 years after his life. We have preserved for us an account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, including named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses, that has been dated back by scholars to within months of his death. That is a news flash from ancient history. When you consider the first 2 biographies of Alexander the Great by Arrian and Plutarch, written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable, this goes back within months. Historians drool over this stuff. So we have early reports. We've also got reports in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts, that all date back right there to the 1st century. They were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up. So got an execution. Jesus was dead. The third E stands for the word empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, member of the Jewish council. It's sealed. Matthew tells us it's guarded, and yet it's discovered empty that first Easter morning. Now, I could go on all night for all the historical data that convinces us the tomb was empty, but I'm just going to give you one fact, because to me this is conclusive. Even the enemies of Jesus admitted that the tomb was empty. How do we know? Because we know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the enemies of Jesus said was, the disciples stole the body. Now think about that. What is that? That's a cover story. They're implicitly admitting the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. You see what I mean? So implicitly or explicitly, the followers of Jesus, the enemies of Jesus, everybody in the 1st century was conceding that the tomb was empty. That's not the question of history. The question of history is, how did it get empty? And you go through the usual list of suspects. The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The religious leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. The disciples weren't about to steal the body. They didn't have the motive, they didn't have the means, and they didn't have the opportunity. In fact, I found 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that confirm that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen from the dead. They were willing clearly to die for this conviction. Why? Because someone told them in Sunday school class that Jesus had risen? No, because they were there. They talked to him, they touched him, they ate with them. Of all human beings who've ever lived, they knew the truth for sure. They were there. And knowing the truth, they were willing to suffer and even to die for it. that tells me something about the depth of their conviction. And then finally, the fourth word that begins with the letter E is the word eyewitnesses. Not only was Jesus' tomb discovered empty, but over a period of time, he appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people. To skeptics and doubters, as well as to believers. To men, to women, to groups, to individuals, indoors, outdoors, daytime, nighttime. They touched them, they talked with them, they ate with them. I mean, think about this. Remember I said earlier, when we look at ancient history, there are things that we believe happened in ancient history. We're convinced they did. And when you get down to it, it's based on one source, or maybe two sources. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. Friends, that is an avalanche of historical data. But how convincing is this? Does it only convince evangelical Christians that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, let me tell you about a guy. When I was an atheist and a student at Yale Law School, my hero was a guy who was identified in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most successful lawyer on the planet. This guy, as a defense attorney, won 245 murder trials in a row, either before the jury or on appeal. Unbelievable. Nobody's ever done that. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records, the most successful lawyer who ever lived. And like me, he was a skeptic about the resurrection. And you think about it. Here's a guy that knows what constitutes reliable evidence, right? Here's a guy who's used to taking what looks like an airtight case against his client and finding all the loopholes, all the problems with that. He was knighted twice by Queen Elizabeth, and he was appointed the Supreme Court of his land. Well, one day, somebody came up to him and said, Sir Lionel, you're the greatest lawyer who's ever lived. Have you ever taken your monumental legal skills and applied it to the historical record for the resurrection of Jesus and come to an informed conclusion about whether he really returned from the dead? And he said, no, I haven't, but I will. And so he spent years researching it through his legal expertise. And I'll recite to you one sentence he wrote that summarized his conclusion. Quote, I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. This from the most successful lawyer in the world. I came to the same conclusion on November the 8th of 1981. After my wife became a Christian and I tried to rescue her from this cult by disproving the resurrection, I spent 2 years of my life using my journalism training and legal training to investigate the evidence, and I came to the same conclusion. And then I read a verse, John 1:12. Interesting verse. It says, yet to as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And I noticed that verse forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. I believe, based on the data of history, that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. Get it? I believe it. It's not enough. It's not enough. I had to receive what? Receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for me on the cross when he died as my substitute to pay for all of my sin. And when I would receive this free gift of his grace, then I would become a child of God. And so I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God.